of God, in whom we live and move and have our being. Amen. Amen. Please be seated. When I was little, a long, long time ago, I grew up in a family with 6 kids. And as we grew, we were allowed to go out and play around the neighborhood with all the other neighborhood kids. And there were a lot of us, a lot of us. And I guess that's why they call us the baby boomers, right? Late every afternoon when it was time to go home for supper, all the neighborhood kids, their parents, would take turns yelling from the front steps to get their kids to come home for dinner. And since there were 6 of us, my parents had a lot to yell about. So every evening at supper time, either my mother or my father would throw open the front door and yell at the top of their lungs, "Vicky, Joey, Laurie, Susan, Judy, Skip!" And one of us would yell back, "What?" And they would yell back, "Supper!" And so it went for many years, for all the neighborhood kids and parents. It was like family supper time litany almost, like evening prayer, only louder. But all us kids did go running home to food and love and homework and chores, and then finally to bed. A ritual that never seemed to get old until we became teenagers. But I do have to admit that there was something pretty wonderful and comforting about hearing our names yelled and hooted and hollered affectionately by the people at home who we knew loved and cared about us. We often speak about being called by God. And it's not exactly the same thing, although sometimes it's not much different. In the church, we speak about our vocation, our calling from God. The word vocation actually comes from the Latin word voce, which means voice. We hear the voice of God calling us. Now, I know that sometimes people get a little skittish around that sort of thing, but mostly I think it's just because we don't really understand it too much. Most of us don't hear God in an auditory way. That is to say, most of us don't hear God speaking out loud to us in a way that we can hear God with our physical ears. Unless, of course, you count bird song or thunder or the sound of the rain or the wind or the waves, which I do, because God speaks through all creation. But for most of us, we hear the voice of God on the inside. We hear God speaking and calling from the very depths of our being, as a movement of our soul, as a deep inspiration or an intuition, as a certainty that will forever remain inexplicable to others, and sometimes even to ourselves. Some of the great saints talk about hearing God with the ears of their heart. The ears of their heart. We have spiritual senses with which to know God and with which to know the things of the Spirit. It's very beautiful, really, because we are made to be in relationship with God, who made us. But it can be easy to be confused. Was that God? People will ask, or was that me? And how do I know? Is it me or is it God? And the answer is yes. Yes. Because the deepest, truest voice inside you is the voice of God. The deepest, truest voice inside you is the voice of God. And we are all called by God. In today's first reading, we have one of the more famous call stories in the Bible. It's beautiful, and it has a lot to teach us. So young Samuel was brought to the temple by his parents as soon as he was weaned and dedicated to God as a very young child. In time, he would grow to be one of the greatest prophets in ancient Israel. As a child, he was put under the tutelage of a very elderly and holy man, the temple priest named Eli. Samuel is still probably very young in this particular story because he doesn't yet know or understand how to hear God's voice, how to hear God's call. But he's about to find out. So young Samuel is lying down to go to sleep one night when he hears someone calling him by name. So of course he thinks it's Eli, the priest, who is sleeping nearby. But come to find out, it's not Eli. And he's the only other one there. Or so Samuel thinks. So this happens 3 times. 3 is a very significant number in the Bible. It happens 3 times before the elderly priest understands that young Samuel is probably being called by God. So he sends him back with the instructions to answer God and then enter into conversation with God if it happens again, which is exactly what happens. And so begins a lifetime for Samuel of being the great prophet, hearing the voice of God and then telling others what God has to say. It's a wonderful story, and it highlights the fact that until we learn to hear God's voice, until we learn to experience God's call, we don't really know what it is. How could we? I find a lot of comfort in that thought, and I found that to be true in my own personal experience, and I find it to be true for many, many other people whose spiritual lives I have the privilege of sharing. The deepest, truest voice inside you is the voice of God. It takes a while to know that, and it takes a bit longer to trust it. But you can trust it. You surely can. There are so many ways in which we are called by God. The most basic one is that we're called into being by God. Each and every one of us is called into being, into existence, into life by God, or we wouldn't even be here. But that's just the first step. There are many other callings over the course of our lifetimes. And then, in the end, we're finally called back home to God. Those of us who are Christians know that we're called to follow Jesus, the Christ, to share the love and mercy and compassion of God for everyone and everything that God has made, that God has called into being right along with us. We're called by our baptismal covenant to seek and serve Christ in all people, loving our neighbors as ourselves. We're called to live lives of peace and lives of justice, of absolute nonviolence and gentle care for all the peoples and creatures of the earth, and for the earth itself. We're called to be in intimate, loving relationship with God, who is the source and goal of our existence and of all existence. We're called to be people of hope, and we're called to be people of joy. We're called to always hear the voice of God calling us and all creation to goodness and wholeness and communion, to oneness with God and with everyone and everything else. So, don't ever forget, the deepest, truest voice inside you is the voice of God. Amen.